Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan and I are going to be out of the studio for a while, and so we wanted to keep the show going by bringing back some previously recorded episodes. This is a show that was originally recorded in 2017, and we hope that you enjoy it.
And if you are listening today, it's been a wet one finally after a long period of drought, no rain. But
I don't know where you're getting this long period of no rain. I mean, it has rained almost every day since May.
Except for the past 5 days.
Okay, 5 days, long enough to get some hay up.
Well, 5 days last week, which has been it hasn't been a typical trend that we've seen this year. So I could say it's
drier.
In relative terms, it's been somewhat of a drought.
Oh, okay. All right. Because, I'll say there might be some wilting if you haven't been able to irrigate.
But I'll tell you one thing, Karen. In terms of a real drought, we haven't had one in a while.
Knock on wood.
You know, even the short periods that we've had no rain, they're very noticeable.
That's true. But, lack of water is something we always talk about as affecting plants, but also too much water is affecting plants. And in fact, I'm getting a lot of calls about leaves that are showing symptoms of nutrient deficiency. And that is directly related to the amount of water we have.
And I was having this conversation with somebody else this past week about just the trends that we see. We have studied some of the rain pattern trends, and in the past 10 years, it seems like we get more frequent rains and heavier rains than ever before. So these long periods of drought that we might have been used to about 10 years ago, even before that, don't seem to happen quite as much. And that's something that, you always have to manage for, especially when you're spraying for pests, when you're working with fertilizers, when you're working with manure. All these things come into play with the weather, and it's something that our farmers have had to adjust, and even some of the homeowners mowing the lawns all the time.
That's why you shouldn't have a lawn. But anyway, that's definitely important to think about, because if you're looking at manure storage or a feed barn, you've got to make sure that your water diversion devices are functional for the quantity of rain that we've been getting. You may need to add an additional downspout if your gutters have been frequently overflowing, and also making sure that water isn't flowing across your floor, because that's going to add more weight to the manure you need to deal with. And so you really want to divert that water away from the barn before it gets contaminated with the manure, and then you have to deal with it. Other things that you are looking at is, we haven't really had much issues with irrigation except for right at the beginning of the season. Those who had irrigation at the beginning of the season were a little bit ahead because it was fairly dry right at planting season, and then it just hasn't stopped raining. And so irrigation hasn't been too big of an issue unless you've gotten too much water. And then, there have been some waterlogged soils that have been hard to drain. So if you are in one of those waterlogged places, you can try to dig a little bit of a ditch in between your rows. So give the water a lower place to sit that's not on the root system of the plants. Obviously, if your planting spacing is really close, you can't do that because you'll damage your root systems. But that's one of the options that's available to you if you're in a wetter area. But we were just talking about the wet's kind of fading away, and, summer's here and dry season is coming. So we're going to start talking about how to deal with dry weather soon. So it is good, though, that we had a couple dry days, got some hay up finally. Yeah. And so, getting that moisture balance down was difficult just because the humidity refused to let anything dry, and a lot of things have gone to head. So hopefully you were able to get your hay up this past couple of days and you got your moisture right. So maybe in the future, if we do start seeing more of these heavy, longer storms more frequent, we'll see a lot more people move into silage so they don't have to dry it as much.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of farmers have done that. And in terms of the first cutting that you get, wet bales are probably the best guarantee for higher quality hay. It's, with the weather like this, you're right, it is really tough to get high quality first cutting. Of course, second cutting is usually a bit easier to get the higher quality for. And then third cutting, sometimes it's even hard to get, period.
Yeah, no, we were at a farm on Tuesday when we did our last pasture walk, and we were talking about how the third cutting, they typically don't even do third cutting in certain pasture fields, on certain hay fields, because they just let it grow, and they stockpile that forage so that they can graze later in the year. And when it's dry and the soil's hard, then you throw some bales out when their nutrient needs are a little bit lower, and also when there's other options available. So they'll supplement a pasture field with some hay, and then keep a couple pasture fields back and not take third cutting off of those hay fields. And then when you put those animals back out in that hay field, you're returning those nutrients back to the hay field, and it helps prevent those fields from getting deficient in phosphorus, which is very common in our hay fields.
Right. And so it does several things. Also, when you stockpile, because you're not cutting the grass and you're leaving everything intact, the grass kind of goes dormant, but its nutrients typically stay a little bit higher than they would if you normally cut it and bale hay with it, because they wouldn't have that long drying period that's necessary to preserve grass in terms of hay. But stockpiling is probably, other than fresh grass, it's probably the next highest quality type forage that you can have out there. In terms of the grasses, there are things like legumes and alfalfa, which is another legume that are higher quality typically because they have more leaf area, higher protein. But stockpiling, wonderful way to ensure you have a field of high quality. It will preserve nice. It'll keep the field from getting damaged. And Karen's right. If it's a tall fescue, some people graze that well into December. Even if there's a light coating of snow, the cattle still will graze on it. It's high quality feed, and they will spread those nutrients out so that the following year that field will be nice and fertile, and hopefully give you some good grass and possibly a good first cutting.
Right. So the question always lands on, okay, how tall does this grass have to be before I can let the cows back into it without damaging the grass and reducing my total overall forage volume? So for cool season grass legume pastures, you want to grow them to 8 to 12 inches in height before you graze them. And you also want to graze to a lower regrowth height to obtain less mature, high quality forage. If you graze at a taller height, you're going to obtain more forage mass, and you can stockpile for deferred grazing. Okay, so you're going to leave a little bit taller of a field when you're getting ready to stockpile. Also, you're going to move your animals out of the pasture when it grows to a 2 to 4 inch height. Now, there's always debate about this 2-inch height, and really it boils down to what do you want to favor in that field. If you want to favor your grasses because your grasses are starting to thin out, but you have really good clover, then you want to leave it a little bit higher, that 3 to 4 inch height. But if you're seeing your clover start to die out, starting to suffer a little bit, you want to improve your clover, then you're going to go down to that 2 to 3 inch height. So it all depends on what you're really managing for. Also, you want to make sure that you have a plan for why the animals are going in and when they're coming out. How are you going to graze for legume development, or are you going to graze for a taller residual height? Now, if it's hot, dry weather, you want to graze to a higher residual height either way, because that is going to put less stress on the crown of the plant, which is going to help your roots still stimulate growth down there.
Yeah, it's a balancing act that you're trying to figure out. The taller the grass is, the more biomass you have, but typically the quality will go down, especially at seed head. When that grass or whatever, just about all plants, whether they're weeds or grasses, when they send out that seed head, there'll be a flower, then the plant goes to seed, and at that point the plant's really accumulating lignin and decreasing its metabolism and nutrient value, and on the protein in the leaves, the free sugars available will start diminishing, but you do have that extra biomass there even though it's lower quality. So for grazing is probably the best way to ensure the most productivity throughout a season. Proper grazing. And Karen's right. if grazing closer to the ground will favor some of the legumes that are kind of shaded out by the grasses. And also, if you leave a field to get stockpiled, yeah, those legumes might suffer a little bit, but then you can always go back in there and frost seed later. And that's just a technique to reintroduce some clover into your pasture fields or hay fields. Well, mainly pasture fields, so that you get the clover good start that following season. But you're always balancing that biomass versus quality. And the taller, the more mature a plant is, the lower the quality, but the higher the biomass. And also, it also depends on the type of grasses that you have in your pasture field. Some of those growing points can be fairly low, and things like orchard grass and fescue can be grazed pretty low, but not all grasses can be grazed down that low. Timothy has a higher growing point, so if you have a field of Timothy that you're grazing and you take it down to 2 inches, maybe a little bit more, you could damage the crown, and then you could lose that perennial cool season grass.
Yeah, also if you have like a Sudan grass, those need to be grazed at a higher rate too. In fact, you want to keep your animals out of a Sudan grass pasture until it reaches 8 to 12 inches. Let it get really tall, although because those crowns are very sensitive to grazing pressure. And if you graze, probably I think Sudan grass is 6 inches, where you don't really want to go below that. And it seems like you're leaving so much out in the field, but really what you're doing is you're encouraging that root mass to bring more food up from the soil and then give it into the plant. So you're going to have a greater overall quantity by grazing it higher. And it doesn't seem like it should work that way, but that really is. You're helping the plant to produce faster and better grass.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about sources and sinks. Sources are the parts of the plant that produce energy, produce sugars, the stuff that makes the plant grow, and the stuff that also provides nutrients to livestock. So when you're close grazing like that, you have decreased the amount of leaf, so the production power of the plant to make those sugars. Now, the roots are not only things that take up nutrients and water, but they're also storage facilities for sugars. So if you're constantly grazing down to where there's not a whole lot of sources to make these energies, the plant's going to be pulling some of those nutrients from the roots before it starts making stuff for the leaf expansion and growth. So if you're constantly close grazing, your plant's at a disadvantage because now it has to regrow the roots before it can regrow the leaves. So if you're consistently going to that 4 inches, even up to 6 inches that Karen was talking about, then chances are your plant has good root reserves and will put most of that effort back into the leaves, which is where the animals are getting the nutrients from. So it's also something to consider, but at the same time, Karen's right. It's all about management. So if you do want to step up your clover a little bit and let some sunlight down into the pasture, to the lower parts of the pasture there, it will favor some of those clovers to come up. And clovers will also put in that nitrogen that'll benefit the grass in the long run also.
Yeah, and you want to make sure if you are trying to benefit for clover growth that you don't add nitrogen to your fields. Nitrogen is going to cause leaf growth to be faster, which means your grasses are going to get taller that much faster and shade out your clover that much faster. So you really want to, if you're working on developing your clover stand in your pasture field, you want to make sure that you are avoiding nitrogen in your fertilizers or keeping it to a minimum amount. Phosphorus is a good thing to add. That's going to help stimulate your clover and help it develop faster. So if you are going to add anything when you're working towards clover, add some diammonium phosphate or something along those lines, and that will help stimulate that clover growth in addition to keeping your pasture fields healthy.
Yeah, and that clover is also putting in the nitrogen that the plant needs. Typically about 30% clover coverage. It can go all the way up to 50. But at 30%, we typically say a healthy stand of clover mixed with grasses will provide sufficient nitrogen for that pasture field. And the nice thing about DAP that Karen was talking about is DAP is not only 40% phosphorus, roughly 40% phosphorus. It's also about 20% nitrogen. So you put that at the right time when the plant's actively growing and you're supplying a minimal amount of nitrogen that will kind of kickstart, the grasses, but also the clover will help too. And that phosphorus will help the clover kind of get a good push on things and hopefully expand and help that pasture become more productive and more ecologically balanced so that it's a healthier pasture.
And you also want to make sure that you have a healthier pocketbook. So you need to make sure you do a soil test before you even think about adding any kind of fertilizer, because fertilizer is expensive.
Yeah.
And so, why would you put fertilizer on if you don't have to? So you need to know where your soil lies before you even start adding fertilizer. And if you're noticing a problem with your plants, think about, if you don't have healthy soil, you're not going to have healthy plants. If you don't have healthy plants, you're not going to have healthy animals with a good rate of gain. So it all starts in the soil, and if you don't know what your soil is doing, you don't know how your plants are going to do. So you got to make sure you do a soil test. Even if you do have to pay for it, it's not expensive. Check your organic matter, and you need to know what your pH is. You need to know what your macronutrients are, and build from there. Knowing what your organic matter is, every couple of years maybe do that test, just so you're making sure you're adding organic matter to the soil and you're not losing organic matter. Most of the times in pasture and hay fields, it's not a big deal for organic matter unless you are solely haying a field. Hay is a huge crop. It takes a lot of nutrients out of the soil. You're taking a lot of tonnage off of that soil. So if you're not putting anything back in those hay fields, you can watch the quality of that hay decrease directly related to what you're losing in the soil.
Yeah, and let the legumes work for you. If you give legumes nitrogen, they'll take it. And they'll be like, all right, cool. Now we got some nitrogen. We don't need to make those little nodules that you see in the roots. So the way legumes work is they make these little things called nodules, these little round balls in the roots. So if you ever pull up a red clover, white clover, or alfalfa, whatever, and you just really pull it up, look at the roots, and you should see a bunch of little balls there. Now, legumes are plants that will make these little structures that will house bacteria that will be able to reduce that atmospheric nitrogen into usable fertilizer nitrogen like ammonia and nitrates. So if you're providing that nitrogen to those legumes, they won't make it. It's a waste of energy. They don't need it, so they won't do it. So management's also allowing what you have to work for you instead of not necessarily against you, but at least it's not giving you any benefits. Right.
So, and if you think about those nodules that are on the root systems of clover, those are houses. Consider that a housing development for really hard-working bacteria that is going to provide you free fertilizer for its entire life. It's going to work for you for free as long as it has a place to hang out inside your clover roots. Now, if you add nitrogen and the clover says, I don't need to do this extra work, I've got all this nitrogen I need, and then all those bacteria are actually going to move away. They're going to say, well, there's no housing here, I can't live here. It's just like people. If there's no housing, they're not going to live there. So the bacteria move away, and then it takes you longer to rebuild those bacterial colonies when you do stop fertilizing with nitrogen. So do make sure that you're keeping that balance, especially if you're just starting a clover seedling. Make sure that they're inoculated seed and that you are giving a good starting point with a low nitrogen content to start your clover out.
That's right. And going back to what Karen said, before you invest a lot of time, energy, and money, do a simple soil test. I know it seems like such a fastidious little thing to do, but it can give you so much information. In fact, all the stuff we're talking about, root length, legumes, and nitrogen fixation, it's all well and good, but the chemistry has to be right. So there is no better way to figure out the pH of a soil than to do a soil test. And if you ask me, the most important thing there is, if you're going to do anything, any kind of input to a soil, is lime, or just that pH. Either lime or don't lime at all, because you might not need it. And if you're liming when you don't need, you're wasting time, wasting money, and actually making it a little bit harder for those plants to grow. Because pH goes on a scale of 0 to 14. And for most pasture fields, we want it right at 6.5, which is a little bit below the acidity of water, which is neutral. But it's right there. So if your pH is if you got that limestone bedrock, your pH could be higher. Sometimes it could be really low. And in that case, you do need to input some lime. And even if you are low in some nutrients, having that chemistry adjusted will make those nutrients that are even slightly deficient in the soil available, and you'll see a great improvement.
And so let's talk about lime real quick. We have a couple minutes left in the show. When you're looking at lime, there is such a thing as worthless lime. And basically, if it's not passing through a number 60 sieve, then you are taking a lot of lime that is not going to react within a time frame that is going to help your crop. So you want the largest amount of lime that go through a number 60 sieve as you can in your mix.
Yeah, because when we talk about neutralizing power, there's a direct correlation between the fineness of the lime and how fast it neutralizes the soil. So if it's not small enough that it neutralizes in a good amount of time, then it's not going to neutralize the soil in the plant's lifetime, and you're not going to get any benefit.
And so you might see some strange numbers on the lime that you get. And every time you buy lime, you should have access to the CCE, or calcium carbonate equivalency, basically how much lime or neutralizing power it has. And you should be able to get the size sieves that it works through. So if you have particles that are passing through a 100 mesh sieve, they're going to react 100% within the next 6 months. And so that's fantastic, but that's a really fine sieve, and you're not going to find a whole lot you're not going to find any lime that goes 100% through a 100 mesh sieve. If you have a 60 mesh sieve, particles going through that, a 60 mesh sieve or finer, meaning the number is bigger as it gets finer, it reacts 100% within the first year. And so that's one of the things we always tell people, the best time to lime was 6 months ago or a year ago, because whatever you put on now is for the next 6 months and next year. It takes a long time for those lime particles to react with the chemicals in the soil to reduce that pH or change that pH. Your particles that are passing through a 20 mesh but not a 60 mesh sieve, they're going to react 50% within the first year. And then particles that don't pass through a 20 mesh sieve have 0 liming values, and you should use them for your driveway instead.
That's right. And I just want to add on, the best time to lime is probably late in the fall to let it overwinter so you're getting a good spring growth. But there's no bad time to put that lime on.
Yeah, so the best time to do it is when you actually have time to do it, and when you have the equipment available to do it. So don't say, well, it's spring, I can't lime because it's not the perfect time to lime. You know what? If it's when you have access to the lime spreader and it's when you have the money to buy the lime, put the lime out there. Get it out there. That's right. The best thing to do.
And it's the best thing you can put on, but that's just my opinion.
All right, and with that, we'll have to bring our show to a close. Remember that when you are looking at your pasture, you need to think about soil fertility, your timing and intensity of grazing, and your balancing of the forage production and your livestock feed demand. And if you have any questions about those things, please feel free to call your local extension office, or you can give me a call at the Ohio County Extension Office at 304-234-3673.
And you can call me, Dan Lima, at the OSU Extension Office in Belmont County at 740-695-1455.
Thanks for listening, and just so you know, this show is recorded live at WWVA here in Wheeling, West Virginia. Thanks again for listening, and have a lovely day.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.